What's up everyone, Thralls Metal here once again. I'm Necrotic Nick and I have an album review for you. So yet another one that came out on the 14th of January, and one that had generally a lot of hype around it was the newest offering from Shadow of Intent, Elegy. Now this is actually self-released, and actually all of their stuff is self-released, which I think is pretty remarkable for a band that has such a tremendous amount of hype and buzz around them. I would have figured this band would have signed with someone by now, but they still put out stuff on their own, which I think is pretty damn remarkable. Now, this band formed in 2013 in Hartford, Connecticut. This is their fourth full-length album, and this is symphonic deathcore. I believe that's what it's described as, or melodic deathcore with symphonic elements. There's a lot of symphonies going on this, a lot of orchestral elements, and the results are very interesting. My exposure to this band is very limited. I've heard random tracks here and there, so this is the first time I've actually sat down and jammed an entire album of theirs. And, well, alright, I was kind of reminded back when a band like Winds of Plague was really getting a lot of buzz, and they kind of had a similar sound, except this is a little bit different. The first two tracks, Farewell and Saurian King, while there is a lot of similarities to be drawn to Winds of Plague and even Flesh God Apocalypse, this doesn't seem to go as full-bore deathcore as I thought it would. Like, generally when I think of deathcore, I think of just big knuckle-dragging, beat-down, sort of, you know, like riffs and breakdowns. There's a little bit more sophistication, maybe, to these breakdowns, because there's a lot of melody, there's a lot of orchestral elements, there's a lot of interweaving melodies that kind of create larger, grander sounds. I don't know. The breakdowns, I feel like the people in the pit are wearing monocles and top hats and maybe eating caviar off of little crackers that are served by a manservant with a tray. I don't know. That's the kind of thing I get. This is kind of a strange album for me just because it's the meeting of two worlds that don't seem to connect very often, because again, deathcore is generally very primal and, you know, built around breakdowns, and then you have orchestral elements, which everything is very lush and pretty, and I don't know, sometimes it really works, sometimes it doesn't. I think where it does work on this, it is where they are at their most primal, and they kind of let the orchestral elements take a backseat, at least a little bit. I think the mix is actually pretty decent here. They don't often let the orchestral elements completely take over, but I'm not saying that sometimes they do, and those are kind of hit or miss with me. Sometimes they're just too damn much. But on songs like The Coming Fire and Intensified Genocide, which props on the rhyme scheme there, those songs are brutal as hell, and the orchestral elements sort of take a back seat a little bit in the mix, and out front come the gloriously awesome death metal vocals on here. Like, these gutturals are really solid, and great lead work. In fact, I was kind of surprised that lead work is all over this. Generally, lead work is something that is a little bit more spotty in deathcore too. A lot of the times it's maybe more dissonant, sort of ambient lead melodies on top of a main chuggy riff. There are actually some really awesome solos on here. And all this kind of works with a very polished production. Generally, when it comes down to like deathcore versus death metal, which I am predominantly more of a death metal fan, you kind of see maybe two different schools of thought there. Generally, deathcore kind of leans more towards the overproduced in terms of a more polished sound. Death metal generally tries to go more raw. I'm not saying that's pretty much entirely the case with either, but that seems to be the case for the most part. And this is definitely more polished. The drums are definitely triggered and really compressed, but overall, I don't think the production on here is necessarily bad. It's actually pretty damn good, and I think the levels are pretty solid. The vocals are very much out in front, and they should be, because I think the guttural vocals on here are really solid. But there's a lot of other things going on vocally that I think were kind of hit or miss. I think this band maybe takes a lot of cues from Dimmu Borgir, and I think that Dimmu Borgir element comes more from albums like Death Cult Armageddon or Puritanical Misanthropia, which are generally the more polished albums that a lot of more like black metal purists don't care for. There's a lot of stuff when it comes down to like the black metal approach to the vocals, or it has a sort of a phaser effect on them that really reminds me a lot of Shagrat's vocals on those two albums in particular. But I actually kind of like those, and they're put in really clever spots. It's the cleaner vocals, and it's not necessarily the way they're delivered, it's the fact that they are very processed. There's like 40 different layers to the vocals, and it just doesn't sound very natural, and that's kind of the thing, like, where I wonder how they're going to replicate that live, because it seems like there's a fair amount of auto-tune in there too, which also drives me nuts. But when it comes down to the harsh vocals, solid. Now, two songs that I really did like that actually involved some pretty interesting guests were Where Millions Come to Die and Blood in the Sands of Time. Where Millions Come to Die actually features a vocal duet with Phil Bozeman. And this song is high energy, it is brutal as hell, very just crunchy riffs. This is very deathcore forward, and, you know, again, this is another one where the symphonic elements are played down ever so slightly. The vocal duet is, well, kind of hard to tell when they actually switch off because both voices are similar, because Phil is not doing his cleans that he does now. Not that there's a problem with that. He does have good cleans. I just don't necessarily like the new album. But anyway, it's the harsh vocals, and their deliveries are very similar, and they're both doing that rapid fire delivery that Phil is known for, so they kind of run together a little bit. Now, Blood in the Sands of Time featuring Chuck Billy from Testament actually sounds like it was tailor-made for Chuck Billy to pop up on there, because this actually brings in some very thrashy riffs. And it's kind of a distinct change from a lot of the riffs on here, because the riffs are predominantly kind of mellow deathish. There's a lot of stuff in here that reminds me of, you know, stuff you'd hear on Hypocrisy albums, or like sort of that mid-era In Flames. But Blood in the Sands of Time has a very thrashy feel in it, and Chuck Billy delivers essentially just one spot of vocals with a very harsh, raspy voice, and actually it's quite effective. I think his section in there is just a nice little breakdown section. And breakdowns are all over this. This is deathcore after all. But I think that one really stood out just because his vocal approach is a little bit different, and the fact that the songwriting is a little bit different. Now, songwriting on this is pretty interesting, though I think they overuse the symphonic elements. I want to say by like about track 6, I was getting kind of tired of it, because they kind of used them a lot in the same way. Like, there's lead-ins that are symphonic, they'll combine that with clean guitars or an isolated vocal passage, but again, you have these waves of strings. I don't know, it's all synths, I think, but it could be strings, I don't know. But it seems like the majority of the songs actually kind of open up that way, and, you know, similar openings, and then there's generally like a spot where most things will drop out except for symphonic elements and maybe some isolated vocals. A lot of that stuff repeats quite a bit. And that, coupled with a lot of the, you know, formulaic stuff, of course you have to have breakdowns, there's big melodic death metal riffs, you know, big kind of heavier thrashy sections, blast beats. Some of the songs can kind of feel a little stitched together. And while I do appreciate the moodier sections on here, there is stuff on here that does kind of sound similar to stuff you would hear on a My Dying Bride album or a Paradise Lost one. There's just a lot of repetition of those same elements, and after a while all the symphonic elements start kind of sounding the same, and they sound like they're just thrown on top of otherwise pretty decent music just to spice it up unnecessarily. And honestly, that kind of makes a lot of the sound very European. In fact, if someone had told me these guys were from Germany, I would 100% fucking believe them, because this sounds like that sort of European style with all the symphonic elements and keyboards in it. Especially if they played me songs like Of Fury and Life in Exile, because holy shit, those are some very far removed ones from the overall deathcore sound. Especially Of Fury. That sounds like a Nightwish song from the rip. It is kind of, well, cheesy. Like, this one kind of strips back a lot of the heavy. It has a main bouncy riff that, I mean, it sounds like Nightwish. It really fucking does, albeit with deathcore vocals. The opening of it is like dark and whimsical. It's like Christmas time in Gotham. And then we're into this kind of bouncy standard rhythm and a riff that is very steeped in melodic death metal, but it's very cheesy. And especially coming off of much heavier material, this feels like a weird push. It just does not necessarily feel like them, or at least maybe only part of them. It gets really jarring considering the first couple of tracks when you hear this song, because it doesn't sound like it necessarily belongs on here. Kind of the same thing with Life in Exile. You have lush strings and synths, and this is where the big cleaner chorus, the hyper filtered one, really just kind of put me off, like, because it doesn't even sound very natural at all. Like, underneath all that there's a human voice, and it's strange they don't use as many filters on the growls, But when it comes down to the cleans, it's like everyone shouting into a bucket and then they fucking, mix it out, and I don't know. Like, I know I just don't like it. And the symphonic elements take a weird turn there. There is a section where they drop out everything except for the symphonic elements once again, and it sounds like Disney on Ice, except Born of Osiris is, playing alongside of it. I just don't get that song, And of Fury. Like, they don't feel like a lot of the other songs on here, just in terms of creativity, songwriting. They feel very plain, and I mean, I wouldn't say singlish because it doesn't feel like they're tailor-made for like any radio station, if people actually listen to those anymore. I don't know. But they do feel out of place. And then the instrumental Reconquest, I have to say, is kind of boring. It's essentially one main metal riff and a steady sort of groovy beat, just a straightforward 4-time sort of beat there. And it kind of feels like it's the kind of song that is built to have a lot of cool lead trade-offs over. And granted, you do get some wild soloing towards the end, but about, 10 seconds after you get those solos coming in, the song is beginning to fade out. The rest of it is just sort of this riff, melody on top of it, and maybe some little transitions in there, but it's just kind of a there instrumental. Like, it's not terrible, but it feels kind of boring. But honestly, where I think this band really did some like cool stuff is on the 3-part title track. And that one, I have to say, it kind of changes some of the dynamics a little bit. Now, the symphonic elements are still there, but there are like keys and passages on there that scream maybe a little bit more progressive. The opening part, Adapt, is kind of an intro track to it, like it's sort of a lead-in. It honestly feels like a bridge that could have popped up on a Dream Theater album. There's a really cool solo, some really cool off-time drums. They're like a little bit more, I don't know, inventive, like it steps outside of the blast beats and the breakdowns. And then the next 2 parts, Devise and Overcome, both kind of showcase everything this band is already good at, with the chuggy breakdowns, big triplet riffs, galloping chugs, but again with proggier sections, like different kinds of transitions. My only gripe on these sections is vocally, and of course it's not the harsh vocals, because I think the harsh vocals in here are killer across the board. It's the clean chorus, and I just don't like this cleaner chorus. Like, it's still growled. It's like, again, 40 voices all at the same time, sort of like blended at levels, and it just kind of comes off as this growling robot. And the chorus itself isn't particularly interesting. I think there was just a lot of stuff that was overdone, like those clean passages in terms of the vocals, way too much symphonic stuff sometimes. Like, sometimes where it's a little bit more subdued and it's more like just like a light seasoning, that's where I think it works the best. When all these symphonic elements are pushed way out in the front, and you kind of just get lost in all the atmosphere and such, like, it just becomes a bit much, and it kind of loses all the, well, things I think you would look for in deathcore. Because, I mean, honestly, deathcore is sort of, I guess, their bass sound, because there is a lot of other stuff going on here. But sometimes all that symphonic stuff really gets in the way and it becomes kind of a distraction. And this album is about an hour long, so there's a lot of stuff in here, and these songs can kind of feel long, especially when you get a lot of elements that, at least for me, were kind of off-putting. You're just kind of waiting for like that part to end, just so you can get back to like, the main riff that was really cool, or a really clever melody, or a cool lead. Instead, no, you had to deal with the entire Philharmonic fucking just right here in your fucking ear the entire time. It gets to be a bit much. But overall, I didn't necessarily think this was terrible. It just had a lot of stuff that kind of annoyed me that was on top of some pretty solid tunes. Symphonic metal is kind of hard for me to get into in general. I think there are bands that do it quite well, like Flesh God Apocalypse, or even Rotting Christ to some degree. But when the symphony kind of takes over the metal band, that's where I generally check out. And honestly, this is kind of close to that. So overall, I'm gonna give this 3 stars. I do like the music. There are some really killer riffs on here, some really killer breakdowns, some outright heaviness that I think is just absolutely pummeling. The orchestral elements need to be either dialed back or ditched entirely, because honestly, like, going through it, yeah, it does add a certain mood to it. It gives it sort of a gothic feel, or just an extra level of more refined darkness, or what have you. But too often on here, it ends up sort of overtaking the band and being overused, and I'm really not into that, so that kind of took me out of it. Still, I will say, this was a pretty fun listen outside of a few tracks in here that I just flat out didn't care for. And if you like symphonic deathcore, I would say check this out. There's probably a good chance you're already a fan of this band, because they seem to have really made themselves quite a name within symphonic deathcore, which is a respectively small sort of subset of deathcore. So, I mean, I think this band is probably on top of that genre. But regardless of what I say, I would still recommend checking it out. Give this band a fair shake. You won't know if you don't like it or do like it until you actually listen to it. So give it a chance, check them out. So if you enjoyed this review, give it a thumbs up, and if you are new to the channel, subscribe, because we do stuff like this all the time. We are also on Patreon. If you'd like to help us out there, there will be a link down below, and we will eventually announce when we get shirts. I'm going to keep laboring this point, because once we do have these shirts, we'll put up a cool video, and that'll also be a giveaway for our 10K, which is insane that we're almost there. Again, here's a part where I thank you guys again, because I fucking mean it. Thank you guys so much for all your support. This has been an amazing ride. We're going to try to make this year even cooler than last year, which last year was better than 2020. That's about the nicest thing I have to say about last year. So let's make this better than both, which again, the standards are kind of low, but we can do it. So with that, thank you all once again, and we will catch you later.